My name is Ron Nolte, and I'm here with my friend Nick Walsh, and we're going to talk about some of the tombstone rubbings that I've done over the last 20 years or so. Tombstone rubbings are done around the world in different ways. Most of these are from the United States. I'm going to start with Ruth Sprague because back in the 1880s in the United States, if you wanted to be a doctor, you had to study the cadaver, and it was illegal for people to purchase a cadaver. So if you were studying to be a doctor, you had to acquire a cadaver one way or another, and most of them were illegal. So normally a funeral was held and a hole was dug for the cadaver, and it was buried with some religious rites. But to get a cadaver legally, doctors would, and medical schools would talk to somebody known as a body snatcher, and the body snatcher would patiently wait around the cemetery until a fresh corpse was buried. It was important to get a body almost immediately after it was buried so that they would be fresh, as they said back then. So, and sometimes medical schools got involved in this also. Colleges might have medical schools, but they didn't normally have legal cadavers. So on this one tombstone from Hoosick, New York, we have all the important players, and they're all mentioned on this stone. The victim in this case was Ruth Sprague. She was a 9-year-old girl, deceased, and she was lined up by a doctor to illegally buy her body, her cadaver. And all the important people are mentioned here. So Ruth is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sprague. And this is in 1800s when purchasing a cadaver was illegal. So you had to steal them. So Dr. Armstrong wanted a cadaver to study, but he had to get one illegally, so he had to be careful. So he contacted Ruth Sprague's. He contacted a man to get him Ruth Sprague's cadaver, and that was Roderick Clow. That's the doctor. And so a body snatcher waited around the cemetery after Ruth was buried. We're not sure exactly when, but within a day or two, the body snatcher would come to the cemetery at night, dig up the body, steal the body, take it to the doctor's office. The doctor would pay him for having stolen a body, and then the doctor would get the body. He would get it as soon as possible. So normally the body snatcher would cut the body up into pieces so the body couldn't be identified, and then get it to the doctor, and the doctor would pay off the body snatcher. And of course, as soon as the parents saw that their daughter's tomb had been violated, why, they would contact the law, the police, and they would try to find out who had stolen the body, which wasn't easy to do. And you notice that the family has changed their attitude about doctors. They've even put it on the tombstone. They say that the doctor has mutilated the remains of their 9-year-old daughter. The body had been dissected by the grave robber who stole it. He calls the grave robber a fiend. Her bones had been cut into pieces to make them hard to identify. And then he talks about what they think of doctors now. Their daughter's soul has risen to God, where few doctors rise. So in their book, doctors won't make it to heaven. Ruth Sprague, body snatcher, a fiendish doctor. And this was done all over the world, all over this country. Sometimes the body snatcher would put the remains in a big barrel and put the barrel on a train and ship it to a Confederate in some other state. That way it made it tougher for the law to find them. Sometimes the medical schools, say of the U of I or any other college, might have a separate fund for paying off body snatchers, and this was all secret. Ruth Sprague. So we have a U.S. military tombstone for Desmond Doss. You can see that he was awarded, you don't win it, you are awarded the Medal of Honor during World War II in the Pacific. Doss was a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they were a Christian church, and they did not believe that Christ would have anything to do with wars. So Seventh-day Adventists did not go into the military to serve shooting and killing the enemy. They went into the military to help out with our own military by serving as medics, where they helped people survive the shooting and killing by hauling wounded and dead Americans off the battlefield to hospitals. Desmond Doss's life was made into a movie within the last couple of years. He was a conscientious objector, CO. He objected to wars and fighting and killing, but he was willing to go into the military as a medic in the Army, serving in the Pacific. He served in Guam. He got his Medal of Honor from what he did on Okinawa, fighting against the Japanese. The movie they made recently about him was called Hacksaw Ridge, because he earned his medal on a mountain ridge on the island of Okinawa, which is the smallest of the main Japanese islands. The Americans moved up the ridge, on top of the ridge, which was held by the Japanese, and there was a battle there that lasted several days. And we were finally driven off the ridge, but of course we left behind lots of wounded and some that were on the verge of death. And Doss won his stripes. This is an image of the Medal of Honor. He won his stripes by searching out wounded Americans on the ridge, which was about 75, 80 feet high. And if they were wounded, he tied them with a rope and lowered them from the ridge down close to 100 feet. And before the whole episode was over, he rescued approximately 75 Americans who had been wounded. So he lowered them to safety with a rope over a period of several days. And it was very hard work, and he didn't have much help. He had hardly any help. So Desmond Doss, he's the only conscientious objector to win the Medal of Honor at that time, World War II. Two more conscientious objectors from the Vietnam War also won a Medal of Honor later on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the Medal of Honor winner from World War I, the hillbilly, Sergeant York. He was from Tennessee too, I think.
Yeah, I believe you're right.
All right, here we have another Medal of Honor winner. This one is also from World War. No, it's not. This is from the Afghanistan War. We've had so many. This is Lieutenant Ashley White, who was married at a very short time after her deployment to Afghanistan during that war. She was part of a brand new organization of the military. In Afghanistan, we were constantly trying to find the bad guys. And we could go into their villages, and you needed to talk to the men because they're a society where the men mean everything and the women don't count. But Ashley was a very athletic young woman. She went to Kent State University, graduated with honors, was a very gifted athlete, especially in running. So about the time she was ready to graduate, the military, American military, came out with a brand new group of service people. In our search for the enemy, we didn't have much luck because the men that we were fighting against, they wouldn't give up any information at all to our men when they went through the villages. But the women and children was a different thing. They were third-class citizens in Afghanistan, but they were always hungry, and they needed food and supplies and all the help they could get. So we decided to try a new tack. We trained a group of American women in the military who were going to go out into combat just like our men. In fact, they went out with our best men. They went out with the Navy SEALs, and they went out with the Green Berets and the Rangers and the SEALs and so forth. because when they went into a camp of Afghans or whatever, the men, our men, would talk to their men and distract them, while our women, like Ashley, would go out and talk to the Afghan women and ask them where they could find the bad guys or whatever information they were after. And they got it. That's why their equipment included weapons, but it also included Tootsie Rolls. So they got the kids and the mothers to talk by bribing them with sweets. And they did get a lot of good information from them that helped us win battles and win the war. Ashley had the dubious distinction of being the very first person in this special unit to die. One of the common threats from the bad guys were the IEDs, and a lot of times they would bury them right in the middle of the village, all in a big circle. And that's what happened here. Ashley and 2 American Rangers, male, were killed when an IED exploded. And she didn't step on it, but one of the other soldiers in our U.S. Army unit stepped on a bomb IED over here on a circle of explosives, and Ashley was standing over here, 100 feet away. But when you set off one explosive, they all went off. That's the photograph of Ashley. She was a lieutenant. She was killed and awarded the Purple Heart and a Congressional Medal of Honor. I happened to be on my way to visit my son in Massachusetts, and I happened to be going quite near where Ashley lived in Ohio, and she was buried in her hometown, and I happened to give her parents a call and tell them what I was up to, and they allowed me to visit their daughter's cemetery and do this rubbing, and I felt quite honored. Since then, the Navy has named one of their fast warships after her, which is their practice. Mary Mallon was an Irish girl who seemed to be living a normal life. She had to work, and so she found her place in society. She was a pretty good cook, and there were lots of wealthy people in Ireland and in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. You could tell she was a good Irish Christian. She mainly spent her life working for wealthy people in the kitchen as a maid or cook. Unfortunately, she was a first. As far as we know, Mary Mallon was the first victim of typhoid fever, which was a very deadly disease. She was the first carrier. She had typhoid fever, but it didn't hurt her. But she carried it, and she transmitted it to other people. So a lot of research was done on her and her effects on the population, and they estimate that she transmitted typhoid fever to between 51 and 120 people in Ireland and in the United States. Only 3 that we know of died, but a lot of them were very sick, and but at least it was a good thing, because we didn't know that you could carry it and not die from it yourself. When they first discovered what was going on, she was in the United States, and they quarantined her on North Brother Island in the waters off New York City, where she'd been working. After a few years, they let her off the island. She went back to work. They thought she'd been cured, but they were wrong. The second time they quarantined her, it was permanent. She was forced to stay on the island until she died. Her 2 stints in quarantine altogether lasted about 26 years. But we did learn something that was important, and she was certainly not the last carrier. Thomas Crapper's name has gone down in the annals of American teenage history, especially. He was English. He was a plumber by trade who eventually rose up in the ranks of the plumbing world, until at one time he was actually a recipient of a contract put out by the royal family for the toilet facilities in their palaces and royal facilities. A lot of people think that Crapper invented the flush toilet. That's not true. But he did raise the image of the royal facilities in England. They improved the looks of the flush toilets, and their name is famous. I know I've piddled around England a little bit over the years, and if you go to like Westminster Abbey or a palace or a royal facility of some kind, a lot of the metalware, a lot of the toilet facilities have Crapper's name still on them. I know in Westminster Abbey there's a lot of toiletware. And the word crap was not in the American lexicon until World War I. When World War I came along, the United States shipped thousands and thousands of American soldiers, sailors, and Marines to Europe to fight against the Hun. And so they stayed over in England for more than a year. We got in the war late and stayed late, but the word crapper was on British toiletware, and including flush toilets. And the Americans, who soon began using them just like the English, became familiar with the name crapper. And so crapper became associated with using the bathroom facilities. And so when the American soldiers and sailors came back to this country from England and France, they spread the word crapper or crap around, and then everybody knew what it had to do with. And we're still using it today in a variety of ways. The Crapper Company did quite well, and they were in business a long time. You've all been the victim of advertising on radio and television and movies for a long time, so you should understand this. Merv Griffin was the first really rich man produced by Hollywood and television. He started out as a big band singer with Freddie Martin and his orchestra, and he was better than his singing voice were his instincts for business, and he became the first really successful entertainment millionaire. In fact, he became the first Hollywood billionaire. He was a singer, a band leader, and then he put those to work for him, and he had his own production company, he had his own studio, made his own movies and TV shows. He had his own TV show that lasted for over 20 years. And when you have TV show or radio show, and when you're done entertaining the people, the first thing they all began to say was, well, we'll be right back after these messages. But when you just died, you're not going to be right back after these messages. And Merv was making a little joke at his own expense. Very successful guy. If you have not read Killers of the Flower Moon or seen the movie, where have you been the last 5 years? Henry Roan is one of the Osage Indians who was murdered to get his oil rights to the Osage Nation rights to their... Quickly, I'll sum up the story. The Osage Indians lived in Oklahoma. Their headquarters is in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. And when they were given that territory in Oklahoma by the U.S. government, the Osage chief came up with a unique deal. He kept the mineral rights to the property on the reservation. And not long after, in the 20s, not long after the Osage took it over, they discovered oil there. And so every year, a lot of oil. So every year now they have a big auction, and people who are selling oil, like Phillips 66 or Gulf or Standard, every year they go to this Pawhuska auction and they bid on parcels of land. They have no idea whether there's any oil there or not. But if there is, it's worth a lot of money. And the Osage Indians get a cut of all the oil land in that area. So that's good for the Pawhuska Indians reservation. People not of the Pawhuska tribe, the Osage tribe, cannot buy that oil land, but they can leave it to somebody in their will. Anyway, white people who lived there wanted to get their hands on the money that was generated by this oil property. The only way they could get it was to inherit it. So they soon figured out a way to rob the Indians of their money. At one time, the Osage Indians were the richest group of people in the world. But if a white man would marry an Indian woman and then she would die, then he would inherit her oil rights. And so when the auction happened, any money that came to the Indians through the oil could be inherited by their husband, their children, whatever. So the white people soon discovered that if they murdered Indians like Henry, they could inherit his oil rights, which amounted to tens of thousands of dollars a year for every member of the tribe. Every member of the tribe got an equal amount of money at these auctions. Well, Henry was assassinated by a hitman hired by some of the white people in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. A couple bullet holes in the back of the head. And that's what was done to many, many, many of the Osage Indians to get a hold of their oil money. This is a tombstone that was put in the Middlebury, Vermont University Cemetery. How did that happen? Well, an archaeologist from Middlebury went to Egypt and, in spite of the laws against it, stole the ashes of Amun Kipesh, 2 years old, the son of the pharaoh. The pharaoh was Senmoset III, who was one of the more aggressive of the Egyptian pharaohs. He took his armies out and captured other territory. How long ago was that? That was 1883 BC. That's a long time before Jesus and Moses and those cats. These are ankhs. They're Egyptian symbols. Well, that's the cross. A Christian symbol also. It's also an Egyptian ankh. Each one means something in hieroglyphics. So this is his ashes. This is his father, and this is his mother. I think this is around, well, it's 2,000 years roughly before Christ. So the archaeologist from Vermont stole the ashes of the young boy, and they were remade into ashes when the archaeologists discovered they smelled so bad. Putting them in a glass case or a steel coffin wasn't good enough, so they buried him in the college cemetery. This is Mercy Brown. She lived in Exeter, Rhode Island, shortly before 1900. Back then, especially in New England, there was a vampire scare. A lot of people in New England, especially Rhode Island, came to believe that if several people in the same family died, that it must be because there are vampires in the area. Well, Mercy was in that situation. She had two older sisters who died before they were 30. And then later on, Mercy had another sister and a brother who were suffering from the symptoms of the disease that was going around. It wasn't vampirism, it was consumption, tuberculosis. Well, another phrase for vampires is the undead. All right. Mercy had two sisters who had died before her, and a sister and a brother who were sick, and she kept getting worse. She finally died from what we know of as tuberculosis, and she died in the winter. So it's winter in Rhode Island in 1892. They don't have any powerful machines to dig a grave. So they had it on the property of the cemetery, they had a shed. And when somebody died in the wintertime and they couldn't dig a grave because the ground was too hard, they would bury them in like a casket and put the casket in the shed on the cemetery grounds to be buried finally, properly, when summer comes or warmer weather. So that's what happened here. Mercy was buried in the wintertime, and so when it warmed up in the spring and the ground got soft, they dug a hole, put her in a proper casket. And then when the weather got a little bit more warm, they looked into the casket to see what condition the corpse was in. And of course, now the weather was warm. And when they opened up the corpse, what did it look like? Did it look like a corpse that had been decaying for months? No. It looked bloody and red because the weather was now warm. And so when they saw that the corpse was not decayed, the conclusion obvious to anybody was that Mercy was a vampire. Because if you don't decay, you're not undead. So anyway, that's what they did in those days. You didn't want to die and be buried in the wintertime if possible. So people were still worrying significantly about vampires right up to 1900. The Chicago Cubs had already been playing for 30 years by this time. I don't know a whole lot about him, but he was in the Navy in World War II. He was a Mormon. He lived in Utah. Nothing interesting there. But this tells the whole story about Russell. You want to do this one, Belinda?
Oh, you were thinking.
You can't read it while you're putting it up. It's forbidden. This is Russell's epitaph. 2 things I love most, good horses and beautiful women. And when I die, I hope they tan this old hide of mine and make it into a lady's riding saddle so that I can rest in peace between the 2 things I love most. Horses and women. I like that one. I bet his wife didn't write that one. I was walking around the cemetery in Memphis one day, beautiful day like today, and I looked down and saw this chunk of stone sticking out of the ground, not very far. And then I looked at it again, and I recognized this. That's a Rotary sign. This is Jimmy Metter. He's not Jimmy anymore. He's 85 years old. But that's the end of his tombstone, epitaph. But I continued to read. And down here is the bottom part of another tombstone. This is the same as this part. And so what do we have here? What we have here is the cheapest Rotarian in Memphis, Tennessee. What he has done is he has dug up a partial tombstone It's cheaper that way. He just took this tombstone and made it his own. Thank you, Jimmy. There aren't too many of those out there. Okay. This is from Key West, Florida, B.P. Roberts, from 29 to 79. This is probably, I have no way of knowing, but I'd say it's probably the most common epitaph in the country. I told you I was sick, but you wouldn't listen to me. Now I'm dead. There are two of these epitaphs within 50 miles of Monticello, Illinois. I'm sure there are many, many more around the country. This is another one of those World War II tombstones. Lois Dean was an aviation machinist mate. And on carriers back in that day, an aviation machinist mate was a gunner on a heavy fighter or torpedo bomber. This one had a two-man crew. One man flew the plane. The other man sat in a turret behind and above the pilot, and his job was to fire above the plane at Japanese fighter planes that were trying to shoot him down. So Lois has been in the Pacific flying against the Japanese for about a year. So he's flown many, many missions. And he flew one mission too many. In 44, they flew in the Battle of Midway. And they were flying against Japanese ships. And a Japanese cruiser hit him with two good-sized shells, destroyed the turret, killed Loyce, destroyed the plane almost to the point where it wasn't flyable. It turned out to be flyable, and the pilot, although wounded, was able to get it back to the carrier Essex, but Dean was dead. So they had to make a decision, and so what they decided was unique, I guess, for that war. They decided that they were just going to dump the plane over the side anyway, so they decided they would leave Loyce in the plane. They do it upright. They did a typical carrier burial, and they strapped him in, and they used the flag, and they had the chaplain preach over the plane. But he went into the Pacific Ocean with his plane and honors, bugle and all. So somewhere Loyce is down there, along with several thousand other people. This is Larry LaPrise. He lived out west. He was a guitar player. He wrote music. Some of it was printed. He lived in Ketchum, Idaho, where he worked for the post office, at the post office. And his greatest claim to fame was he wrote one really popular song, and I even danced to it once at a wedding. He wrote a Western ditty called The Hokey Pokey. And when Larry was buried, everybody was aware of that. And he was honored. They did him upright in the funeral parlor. And everybody was coming in to see what Larry looked like. And everything was going pretty well until it came time to put him in the casket. And you know, they put his left foot in, and they put his left foot out, and you could get up and dance this if you want to. Thank you. This is another World War II American. You can see that he survived the war. Actually, this is not his real name. This is a phony name. His real name was William Patrick Hitler. He was the son of Adolf Hitler's half-brother. His father was German, his mother was Irish. They met in England, and he was kind of a beggar. He couldn't find a good job on his own, but when Adolf Hitler rose to power in the 1930s, he thought surely Uncle Adolf could find a good job for him, so he moved back to Germany, and he kind of put the pressure on his uncle. It's hard to put pressure on a guy like Hitler. But he did find him 3 or 4 jobs. He didn't like any of them very well. He tried to blackmail his uncle. He made it clear to him that if he didn't find him a really good job, that he would write magazine articles about him published in the United States. The kind of articles that Hitler wouldn't like. But that didn't work either. He did move back to Germany eventually and lived there full time until shortly before World War II, when he figured out it was time to get out of there. And he came back to the United States, and the war was about to start, so he tried to join the military in the United States. But with a name like Hitler, it was going to be hard to get into the military. So anyway, he wrote to his draft board, he wrote to his congressman, and eventually he was allowed to serve in the United States Navy. He had had some training as a medic. So during the war, he did serve in the U.S. Navy. He was wounded a couple times in Europe. But you can be sure that the people he served with kept an eagle eye on him during the fighting. But he survived it all, and Hitler got over it. He had other things to worry about. Here's one, Nick. I'm expecting you to get this one.
Okay.
Harold Sakata was born in the Hawaiian Islands. During his lifetime, he was a world champion weightlifter. He was an Olympian weightlifter. He served in World War II in the Army. He became a movie star. He was made famous by his hat, which was steel.
Drawing a blank.
Steel derby hat.
Oh, the little guy, in the Bond movies, right?
What's his name? What do they call him?
Can't remember.
Okay.
Dropping the ball.
Yeah. Yeah. It was Goldfinger where he threw the hat and cut the statue in half. Odd job, they called him. Yeah. Cool guy. Yeah, I couldn't think of that when I got over there. He's buried right close to the Hawaiian Air Force officer that was going to be the Challenger head guy. This is Mary Dallensey. She lived in Whaling Port, which is a suburb on the island. Yeah, I need to write that down. The nice island off the coast of Maine, or Massachusetts. Beautiful place where all the rich people live. Gay Head. Well, anyway. Mary Dallensey had a son. She lived in the high rent district on Martha's Vineyard. And her son was one of those people that was going to always check out the latest cult. And he disappeared in the 80s. And his mother put this up for him. She didn't know where he was. She was afraid that he'd run afoul of somebody like the people who died from the Kool-Aid.
Oh, Jim Jones?
Jim Jones. the Jim Jones news came out, the Kool-Aid news, and she was afraid that her son had fallen in with them. She contacted the government, and the government looked all over for him. They especially looked for him in California. Couldn't find him. So she put up this marker for him, putting all the blame on her son's disappearance on the U.S. government. So she cursed him. May eternal damnation, not just, for a week or a month or a year, but eternal damnation, be upon those in Whalingport who, without knowing me, the mother, have maliciously vilified me. May the curse of God be upon them and theirs, not just them. So everybody kept looking, and guess where they found him? In prison. Her son wasn't as great as she thought he was. Yeah, my son David lives not too far from there, and I've had him check this. He did this for me, and I've had him check out Whalingport, and this is several years ago, and he said it's still there, it's still thriving, nobody's dying from a curse. Now we're all the way back to Pawhuska, Oklahoma, the Osage Indian Reservation. This is the grave of Maria Tall Chief, who was the first prima ballerina in American history. She was a Native American. Her father, Mr. Tall Chief, was a chief in the Osage tribe, and her mother was white, so she was a breed. But she was a great ballet dancer, and back then, people like Maria Tall Chief didn't show up very often. She was feted, honored in Europe, Asia, Latin America, North America, all over the world for her brilliance as a ballet dancer. She left the Osage Reservation when she was about 4 years old, and her parents took her to find a better teacher to get better teaching, and they took her to Beverly Hills, and you couldn't do much better than that back then. Not only was she a great dancer, she was a great organizer, entrepreneur. She started the Chicago Ballet. She had a sister, Marjorie, younger sister, who was also a prima ballerina all over the world. They started several ballet groups, and you can find on YouTube, you can find movies of her dancing. She got lucky. It was like a match made in heaven. She had some pretty good teachers, but she came across George Balanchine, or George Balanchine came across her. He was the greatest director and teacher of ballet in the world back when she came across him. And he helped her on her way and made her what she was. They even married for a while. They didn't stay married, but they stayed teacher and student. Builder of Chicago, that's builder of Chicago Ballet, yeah. her last husband was Mr. Passion.
Is this going?
That's not so easy to get up, is it?
Didn't know. How does it go?
It goes just like this.
Okay.
You got lucky.
Okay.
I never know how to put it up. As you can tell from this tombstone, what shape is it in?
Circle? Or,
Well, right. It's an orb. It's a big cylindrical rock. This is in a small tombstone in a small town that doesn't exist anymore. It was called St. Omer, O-M-E-R, north and east of Charleston. Never had more than a few buildings in it. But it had a couple hundred people who lived there for a while. Now nobody lives there. But there was a family named Barnes, B-A-R-N-E-S, and the daughter was named Carolyn. And she wasn't very popular in the village. She scared a lot of people. This is in the age of superstition all over the country. Anyway, Carolyn was feared by people in the village. She did weird things. I've seen some of our students do weird things once in a while. But anyway, she did some really strange things, and people in the village back in those days thought that she acted like a witch. So a lot of people began to blaspheme her and treat her like a witch. And finally they decided that they needed to get rid of her. So she was tried and convicted and hanged for witchcraft. And so back in those days, she lived near Salem in Massachusetts. Back then they hanged people they thought were witches. But she didn't go quietly. At the gallows near Charleston, they strung them up at night, and that's where all the Salem witches were hung. So as they led her up the gallows, she said something like, "You're not going to get rid of me so easily. I'm coming back, and I'm coming back on the anniversary of today, the anniversary of my hanging." And they hung her. But you can tell that the people in the town were worried about her. So they tried to do something, they tried to think of something they could do that would make it impossible for her to come back. So they did. The day they hung her was February 31st. She ain't coming back on that day. Thank you, boys and girls. I made it. I couldn't believe I made it.